Next up, we have Russ Childers. And I've known Russ for over a decade because Georgia is one of the states, most of the states prior to the ACA had some form of a high risk pool to try to stabilize the individual and small group market for people with pre-existing conditions. Georgia did not, still does not. They actually passed a bill but never funded it. And I've been working with Russ to try to get that done in Georgia unsuccessfully for many years. Russ was president of both the Georgia Association of Health Underwriters and the National Association of Health Underwriters. And he's been an insurance agent for many, many years. So he really understands insurance, which can be a very complicated, complex topic. I asked him to come talk to us about living in rural Georgia. What's it look like in rural Georgia now from a healthcare perspective? And what can we do in the insurance market to improve things? Russ?
Thanks, Kelly. I promise one thing, I'm going to talk a lot slower. First, I'd like to say I think the direct primary care model is a great model. There are insurance companies with small groups that will work with a primary care model and offer rather substantial discounts to their product if the employer pays for direct primary care, or the employer and the employee pay for it. I think it's a great idea. In fact, I've got several friends that are direct primary care physicians and say that they do about 2/3 of their medicine over the telephone now.
That's correct.
Rather than in person, because they know what their symptoms are. They call their doctor, they tell them their symptoms. Most of the time it's something fairly simple that can be solved with one visit or a prescription or something like that. Or perhaps stop doing that, But the market in Georgia, and here we're talking primarily about the individual health insurance market. Now, that doesn't sound like a big market, but in Georgia it is a big market because over the last 10 or 12 years, a lot of small businesses have stopped providing insurance for their employees. And by small businesses, I would say we're talking about companies with 35 to 50 employees and smaller. So those people, particularly those who are good stewards, I guess you'd say, of their money and try and protect their families against unforeseen happenings, have tried to pay for individual insurance, and the cost of that has continued to go up. And particularly very recently, the bad news right now in all of Georgia, but particularly in rural Georgia, is in the individual market, there's very substantial market instability. Until about a month ago, a substantial part of Georgia wasn't sure that they would have an individual health insurance carrier in those parts of the state. You would think that perhaps the President's announcement last night might have changed that, but that had been the folks in control guessed right, and took care of that about a month ago through a second rate increase that the companies were allowed by the Department of Insurance. That was criticized rather roundly in the press, but the Department of Insurance understood that there was a likelihood this would happen and that it would create even worse market instability to ignore it. So insurance costs are way up. They've more than doubled since 2013 in the individual market in Georgia. Claims have to be up. To some extent, that does and doesn't make sense. The plans that have been offered through ACA, poor people have better access to those plans. The big problem is that perhaps people that were paying for plans earlier that don't get subsidies have now been priced out of the market. So you've got them, instead of the very poor people not having access to coverage that's affordable, The middle class doesn't have access to coverage that's affordable, and people that are well off are beginning to wonder whether they're better off not buying insurance and just paying the bills. Before last night, my next comment was going to be that the unsure nature of the cost sharing reductions was sort of the last straw that we had built, that there's built into the rates in Georgia right now an increase that was somewhere in the 30 to 50% range that were to take the place of the money coming from the federal government for cost sharing reduction. And just to briefly explain that, it's written into the law that the insurance carriers will reduce deductibles, co-insurance, and co-pays and out-of-pocket maximums for people below a certain income level. They have to do that under the law. What the president did was he took back the money that technically the Supreme Court had decided several months ago hadn't been approved by Congress. He took back that money that was helping them provide those cost-sharing reductions. So what does that do? It increases rates 50%. What it does for the people that are receiving subsidies and cost-sharing reductions is nothing, because the premium they pay is based on what they pay, not on a reduction that the federal government helps them with. So if their premium was $100 and they were paying $20, now it's $200, they're still paying $20. The federal government just took the money from cost sharing reductions and moved it over to premium subsidies. I was also going to say last night that if that didn't happen and the insurance companies were reassured that cost sharing reduction reimbursement would carry forward into the next year, that we may not have that 50% increase. But that's not going to happen anymore. So what happens? The people that are paying premiums for insurance coverage are going to pay a lot more premiums for insurance coverage. There are several other things that are creating this instability. 1332 waivers have been mentioned, the waivers that states can obtain for trying to work with the insurance market in their states. My understanding is that in a couple of solidly Republican states, they've been denied recently. My information says Iowa and Utah were denied waivers. You'd think with Chuck Grassley in Idaho and Orrin Hatch in Utah, they would have had some influence on that, but perhaps no. The current market in Georgia right now was roiled about 3 months ago when Blue Cross Blue Shield announced it would pull out of the individual insurance market. They were finally convinced by the Department of Insurance that to stay in the 75 counties in Georgia that would not have had an insurance carrier as a result, the other carriers in the market are Alliant, which is a small carrier that's primarily been in northwest Georgia over the last few years, but now is going to cover pretty much all of the state north of Atlanta, outside the metro area. So the mountains from over around 85 back around to west of Atlanta. Heard County, I think, is one of the counties over there. Kaiser is still going to provide coverage in its coverage area, which is primarily in metro Atlanta, and a company called Ambetter, who has been in Georgia for many years as a managed Medicaid provider, is going to pick up the regular individual insurance coverage in the rest of the state, which will primarily be southwest Georgia in the area between Macon and Atlanta, with some exceptions in East Georgia. That market will have increases of 50% twice since the last rates people saw. So those people that are calling my office to find out how much their insurance is going to cost, we have to tell them we're not going to know till week after next, the week before open enrollment, but it's going to be a lot more. And these are people that were scraping to afford coverage as it was last year. To a great extent, these are people that might have some health problems, perhaps not currently being actively treated, but blood pressure problems that could lead to heart attacks or strokes, or cancers that may have gone away for now but might come back. Other things like that. They're trying to maintain coverage because they're trying to be good citizens, and they may not be able to do that. That's not to say things were better before ACA. I've been in the business 45 years. Before ACA, if you were poor or if you had a health problem, you were pretty much out of luck in Georgia and a lot of other states. At least 14 and probably more like 16 to 20 states. If you had a health problem, you were out of luck because we didn't have a high-risk pool, and neither did any of the other states. And I should have qualified that if you were poor but not poor enough to qualify for Medicaid, because you still had Medicaid as a backstop. The system was broken in many states. Rates were 2 to 3 times our rates here in Georgia, which we felt like were high. In New Jersey, we would go to national meetings of insurance agents and sit at the table next to New Jersey and pick on them because their rates were so much higher than ours. There was a high-risk pool failure in Kentucky. There was no carrier for a while, no carrier that would provide coverage in the state of Washington for a few months until the Department of Insurance convinced a carrier to take coverage at a much higher rate. So in general, we've just traded old problems for new problems. And the reason is we're not paying attention to what the problem is. To some extent, it's the cost of health care. But I think the better way to look at it is it's what you were talking about in terms of cost of health care. It's more the cost of all the other stuff. By the way, in talking to direct primary care physicians, one of the things that I found interesting was as I talked to them, they said, so I'm in medicine, I'm not in sales, can you help me sell my direct primary care practice? So we're talking about that. Yeah. So we may not sell as much insurance, we may sell more direct primary care. So I've talked a long time now, so I'm going to be quiet. Thanks.